Hey everyone, my name is Tim Gaines.
And I'm Shawna Gaines, and it's really good to be with you talking about politics in the year 2020.
Something that I know you probably all tuned in for, but politics are here whether we want them or not. Love it or hate it,
Yeah,
here we
folks
are.
in your church will all tell you that they hate politics, and they hate it when they have to hear about politics in the church, which usually just means that they hate hearing about politics that make them uncomfortable or disagree. They'll also tell you that they hate it when the church gets political, which they usually, again, mean they hate it when the politics of the church rubs them the wrong way, keeps them on the outs, or somehow fashions life in a way that they're opposed to, right? So most of the time we think about politics as being powers opposed to one another, and that's the part that people hate. But the truth is that politics is about how we structure resources and society in ways that allow people to live together, right? That is what politics is, and there is no escaping it, loving it or hating it.
I think what you've just described is more partisanship. That's often the language I'll use. Partisanship is that power struggle. But politics really is the way that we together discern how we're going to take what we have and arrange that in specific kinds of ways. And so we have to be honest about the fact that the church is political. The church makes political decisions all the time. And we don't just mean that in this kind of nasty sense where it like leaves this bitter taste in your mouth, but that we are always making decisions about how, as local communities, we are using the resources that we have, arranging power dynamics and structures, what ends and aims and goals those power structures are attempting to serve. And then we also are a part of this great national and global conversation on things like immigration, things like healthcare, things like race, things like economics, even wearing face masks now has become somehow politicized. And so we've got to be able to have some handholds to be able to engage that. So part of what we'd like to do in this short video is to engage some of those questions. Is to engage some of those questions with a kind of biblical and theological vision, because if we don't have something like that, we're oftentimes left in the partisan categories that Shawna has just described. In the power struggle. That's all we have left.
And all we can do is fight one another if all politics is power struggle.
So is there another way? Well, we actually wrote a whole book about that. We'd like to offer that book as a resource. It's called Kings and Presidents. We actually wrote it several years ago. I also want to look 8 years ago, so 2 presidential election cycles. But let's see. The Foundry has now made available sermon outlines and an entire small group curriculum for free through the website. And so if that could be a resource to you, I would certainly help you take it up. I really love hearing from churches when they use this book as a way to engage some of these questions together. And it's fun hearing from a lot of pastors and small group leaders on what's taken place there. So those are available.
And like you said, if you want to deflate the balloon of power struggle around politics, there's no better way than to just talk about it, to sit in a room full of human beings, right, that aren't just names on social media or bloggers that you can go after, but in a room full of human beings to really discover what are the interests that really matter to people. I think just sitting down in rooms and talking with people is a really important thing for pastors and churches to make space for in a year leading up to an election cycle.
So you're watching this video, there's probably a comment section underneath it. We are going to try to offer some biblical and theological vision for something that's not just the partisan power struggle, and offer some pastoral recommendations on how local communities and congregations can be able to engage in something that is beyond the power struggle. But if there's some other resource that you found that's been really effective, I would love to hear from you, and we could begin a conversation. And usually, friends, the comment section can get a little toxic in the realm of social media. But what if there was a way beyond that? What if there was something beyond just the power struggle? Maybe the comment section could be something beyond that today. So I guess the question is, why 2 Kings? This is a book that's actually written. It says Kings and Presidents. It walks through the first part of the book of 2 Kings. So why did we write this? Why 2 Kings? What was the background here?
So at the time, we were co-pastoring a congregation in California and leading up to the 2012 election, which again, I mean, the year 2020 makes you long for any other year. They all seem wonderful in comparison to the one that we're in.
We only argued about politics half the time, and it wasn't our entire life.
I know.
Like it seems like it is now.
2012 seems like a dream. So we were getting ready for the election of 2012 and studying the book of 2 Kings. And what we found in the book of 2 Kings is we were studying and preparing for a sermon series that would be 4 weeks prior to the election and 4 weeks after the election, walking through that first half of 2 Kings, was that this is a book filled with stories and narratives about the people of God living in the world of kings, a world of politics, and even a world with power struggle, wars, armies, boundaries, and borders. They are living in this world, right? They're not living in some fairy tale land where that doesn't exist, and neither do you, neither do your congregants. So the people of God living in this world, the world of kings, and yet constantly juxtaposing the world of kings with these incredible stories of widows and slave girls and prophets and desperate mothers. I mean, these stories that just absolutely like snap you out of the doldrum that is the world of kings and power struggle. And you recognize that the power struggle that's going on in the world of kings, where they're fighting over who gets the most sheep, literally, read 2 Kings, where they're fighting over sheep is absurd when you are listening to the stories of mothers who are so desperate that they're fighting over who gets to eat the other's baby. Again, it's in the Bible. Read it. It's crazy stuff. But it's there to really be shocking in a sense. It is to call out the absurdity of the power struggle. That's what 2 Kings is doing. It's illuminating the absurdity of the power struggle as it juxtaposes the stories of prophets and slaves and widows with the story of kings and army leaders and things like that. And so that's really what we were diving into, was that incredible juxtaposition.
So preparing to walk a congregation through a presidential election cycle meant that we needed something beyond the partisan power struggle to be able to offer to them. And the gospel has that. The story of our faith has that. And we wanted to offer them something beyond what they're getting, the given options, so to speak, between left or right or whatever it might happen to be. Even just a politics that thinks it has to choose between left or right. We wanted to try to challenge that simultaneously. And 2 Kings, we found, does that masterfully. It puts all of these stories together and it weaves them around the prophetic ministry of a man named Elisha, who is calling God's people over and over to what God is doing in a way that a lot of folks didn't expect. And the author of 2 Kings has constructed this book in this beautiful way that snaps you from one vision of politics into another vision of politics and is basically daring you. Which one of these visions is going to capture your imagination? Which one of these are you going to align your life with? A really good example of this, if you want to look at this, is in 2 Kings 3, 4, and 5. I like to call this a story valley, because it starts in 2 Kings 3 on what I'll call a mountaintop. It's a story about kings who are preparing to go to war and actually going to war over resources. They see that a neighboring kingdom has a bunch of sheep, which was signified a lot of wealth in those days. And so they form this political alliance. They go to war. They lose all of their army and they gain no sheep. It's an absolute debacle. And it's almost kind of poking fun at kings doing what kings do, blinded by this vision of politics that is predicated upon grasping at the most wealth, grasping at the most resource, grasping at the most power. So that's 2 Kings 3. Then we enter in 2 Kings 4 into what I like to call the valley, which is the story of people who are utterly powerless. We're talking about widows here. We're talking about a woman who can't even afford to maintain her sons anymore. So she's thinking about selling her sons as slaves. And Elisha has to come and work in the midst of situations like that. We're talking about prophets, these men of God who don't really even have enough to eat. They're just making soup from the stuff that they find growing around them. And then after that, we climb out of the valley again into 2 Kings 5, and we encounter the story of Naaman, who is this great warrior, again, from a neighboring kingdom, who is absolutely blinded by this vision of needing to be the biggest and the strongest and the most powerful. And even when he encounters an Israelite slave girl who is trying to tell him how to cure the skin disease that is afflicting him, she says, go over to Israel, go to Elisha, go find this man of God. And Naaman can't even see it. He does go to the neighboring kingdom, but he seeks out the king instead of seeking out the prophet. And it does not go well when he goes to seek out the king. So what we have here is this Story Valley, these two hilltops, so to speak, where the writer of 2 Kings is arranging these stories and saying, this is the political vision that tends to guide most of us these days. This is the political imagination that's taken hold of us. But if you can see what God is doing in the valley, maintaining faithfulness in this strange way to God's people, especially those who don't have a lot of political power, it begs the question of where you are going to line up. Are you going to try to line up with one of those kings, or are you going to line up with what God is doing to make a way for God's people in the valley?
And the thing is that what God's doing, the political reality that God is making available, is breaking in right in the middle of the reality of the kings. And this is the way Christians understand new creation, that new creation is springing forth right now from old creation. So for the people of Israel, God was making a new political reality accessible to them through this covenantal relationship that God enters into with Israel. This new political reality that becomes possible in covenant faithfulness with God. But then in Jesus Christ, that political reality becomes embodied, infleshed in the crucified and resurrected body of Jesus of Nazareth, right? His body is a political statement. And so then on the other side of the resurrection, there is a new creation politic that is available for Jew and Gentile, in which all things are being reconciled to God's self. So we'll talk about this. Actually, we're going to walk you through a couple of things that we think we're going to offer as indicative of new creation politics. What does new creation politics look like bursting forth even in the midst of old creation? So in new creation politics, anything else you want to say about just the description of new creation politics?
Well, just simply that we're not just talking about a religious idea as if that's somehow separated. God's people never thought about politics and religion in somehow separate categories.
Right.
For the life of God's people from the beginning, you think about the fact that the palace in Israel was connected to the temple. And so there is this deep connection here where we as modern people have tended to separate church and state the way we tend to talk about it now and think about these things in separate categories. That's just historically not the way that God's people have tended to do that. And so when we think about politics, we tend to kind of push it off to the side, which then means that religiously we're also treating our theology over here. And part of what we're suggesting here is that our theology is deeply political because God is making the world new. This is the gospel of Jesus, that God isn't going to leave creation to its own devices to spin out of control. God is doing something in the world to bring real change, real transformation, real redemption, which means getting in the midst of real situations. If Christian faith is based on the confession that God became flesh and stepped into real situations, there's no way that this is not a political faith that deals with very real situations in the way that we live today.
So what is God doing in the world? God is reconciling all things, right? God is at work in reconciling all things in creation. So new creation politics is where we see true reconciliation happens. Now, we described the power struggle earlier, right? So the power struggle necessitates dualities. And by that, I mean dividing things up into categories so that you can pit one against the other. It is oppositional by nature. And you have to have different parties. You have to, draw lines so that you basically have an enemy that you can face.
Us versus
face
them.
off at,
yes,
right?
There always has to be one. Yeah.
And so in a new creation politics, the goal and the aim is not for one side to win the power struggle. Now, sit with that for a moment, right? how much of our energy and even prayer life often goes into, oh God, would you help this one side to win the power struggle? I mean, sit with that. That's often how much of our, whatever that side might be, we're praying that God would still work within the categories of old creation, these dualistic categories, rather than praying that God might break us free and reconcile all things to God's self. Now, the amazing thing about God is that God still works. Like, God's still at work in systems where the House and the Senate and the presidency are all divided into who's red and blue, Republican, Democrat, Green Party, whatever. Like, God still works in the messy middle of all of that. But what our prayer is not that one party would win the power struggle, but that God would reconcile all things. And so, and that prayer that God would reconcile all things in new creation, that's a prayer that is holistic, not dualistic, not just about which side of the power struggle wins, but how do we see the wholeness of God's creation, all that God created, coming to it. We'll talk about in a moment the flourishing of all creation. But that holistic vision of reconciliation is not generic. So, right, I just named the fact that God's not about the power struggle winning of either Republican or Democrat or Green Party, but that also doesn't mean that, like, just all parties matter, right? It's not just like a generic kind of politics. We love the show. Well, should we say what show we love? Oh, okay. Just going to go right out there. I won't tell you ever who we vote for, but I will tell you that we watch the show Community. And in it, there's this hysterical bit where they want to create a mascot. And in creating the mascot, they don't want to... For community college.
In case you've never seen it.
Yeah. They don't want to be offensive to any one group. And so they create a mascot that is called the Greendale Human Being. And it literally is a guy walking around in a gray suit because they don't want it to have any particular skin color or anything. And with this weird, like, face drawn on him so that there's nothing particularly descriptive about, it's just a human being. But
it's offensively nondescript. It lacks any kind of particularity whatsoever. No identifying characteristics because nobody wants it to look like anything.
And it's almost, it's horrifying kind of in the sense to think that what makes us human is our particularities and uniqueness. So what we're saying is not that this is the politics of the Greendale human beings, right?
Yeah,
this
that
is
nothing really matters, that you don't have to have.
Yeah.
But what we are trying to say is that it's not that this politics doesn't aim at your own party winning for the sake of winning. That there is a vision beyond this of all things being reconciled according to the way that God is making all things new. And so if we pray for anything, is we pray that God would align us to participate in the way that God is making all things new in very particular ways, namely through the way of Jesus.
Because God chose to reconcile the world through the body of a first century Palestinian Jewish man, right? That is particular. I mean, that's real specific from the village of Nazareth. Like it's very specific, particular flesh. God is choosing to reconcile the world through the particularity of Jesus Christ. And so all of our particularities are taken up and a part of what God is reconciling. We don't have to try to become some like generic form of human being or generic form of political preference, right? That all of these things are being reconciled in the work that God is doing to bring new creation in the midst of the old. So in this new creation politics where God is reconciling all things, one of the pastoral recommendations that we would give for folks that are aiming at new creation politics, reconciling all things, is to really listen to stories of people and hear their particularities, hear the specifics of their stories. For instance, there is a community across the street from our church that is a historically black community. Our church is a majority white culture church, and we've had an important relationship with the neighborhood across the street, and there's been a lot of relationship there. But in these days, recently, we've had a lot of folks in the church say, "Man, I just wish that there was some way that we could connect more with the Napier community." Recently, the principal of Napier Elementary School reached out and asked if if we would like to participate, a group of folks from our church would like to participate in a conversation that was going to take place with a few representatives from the local elementary school, several members of another congregation that was a majority Black culture congregation, one other congregation, and then ours. And that we would talk together about some of our experiences in the light of, protests that have been happening and a lot of conversations around Black lives. And so we jumped at the chance to get to participate with our neighbors to really hear their stories. She sent me the agenda right before we were about to go in, and immediately I had this nervousness of, oh, is this going to be political? Which I should know better than that. If you've heard everything that I've said, I should know better than that. But as I was reading over the agenda, it was going to begin with people sharing their stories and their experiences, sharing their stories with encounters with police officers and things like that, sharing their stories and experiences. And then it was going to end with talking about what is the vision of a good sheriff, one who really would care for the flourishing of our neighborhood and community. And what it was doing was allowing specific stories and experiences and encounters of our neighbors to help us think about and craft what does it look like to then elect people who really do care for our neighbors in our neighborhood. And I'll be honest, it was still one of those conversations that you walk into with fear and trepidation, but it was an important moment for us to hear the stories of our neighbors and then to ask ourselves and imagine, wow, what kind of representatives and policies are really going to create the environment where our neighbors know that they are loved by the God that created them.
And what I love about that is that it attempts to transcend just that partisan battle, this versus that. Let's imagine together what a vision of something that is good is. And the thing that we cannot escape is that the Christian faith does have a vision of political goodness. Primarily, that's given to us in Jesus, but then also we see that explode on our imaginations in Revelation. So the book of Revelation, I know, is probably not where many of us spend our devotional time, but it gives us this deeply political vision of goodness, especially in chapters 21 and 22, where we get a vision of the new Jerusalem. It's a new city. It's a new polis, where we get the term politics. So it is this vision that's being given to us with the slaughtered lamb at the middle of all of it, so that the slaughtered lamb is setting the agenda. It's setting the vision of goodness for all things. And Christians from the very beginnings of the faith have looked to texts like Revelation 21 and 22 and said, that's our vision of goodness. Certainly, it's also Jesus of Nazareth walking around doing the things that Jesus did, saying the things that Jesus said, but it is also given to us in this eschatological sense, the sense of God's future breaking into the midst of the present in this political way. And so one of the other aspects of this new creation politics is that it aims at this flourishing of all of creation according to the way of Jesus, not in this generic way, not in like trying to brush off the particularities, but saying, no, in this way, Jesus laying down his life and calling a group of people to follow in his humble way. And this is what we oftentimes call the scandal of particularity. The fact that that is so scandalous. It's so scandalous because it is so particular. It can't just live in these generic categories that's just kind of nebulously not offensive, like the Greendale human being as a mascot. So it is the way of Jesus that leads to the flourishing of creation. And one of the things that the Christian faith continues to stake its existence on is that the way of Jesus really is what God is doing to make the world new. And because Jesus became flesh, there's no erasing his particularities. Jesus did certain things and not other things. He said certain things and not other things. And so every time we try to make Jesus into something in our own image or to fit our own political image, he always wants to explode those categories. If we want to have our political imagination redeemed, we cannot hold on to our own political categories. We must allow Jesus himself to explode those political categories and to give us a new vision of how we can arrange life together. And when we see Revelation 21 and 22, we see all of creation flourishing. Why? Because all of those other political entities, those beasts, those massive, clanging economic realities that are going to hold people down and put some people in a lot of power and hold other folks out, are destroyed, not by this massive beast, not by a lion, but by a lamb who has been slaughtered. If we sit with that, we can see the radical reality of what the Christian faith is saying about the way God is redeeming this world. It's not just that God is challenging these things, but that creation is meant to flourish precisely because God has acted in these ways. And we are faced with that reality. Are we going to line up with one of these kings, one of these clanging beasts? Or are we going to line up with the King of Kings, who has become a slaughtered lamb and taken up residence on the throne in the middle of this flourishing creation as a slaughtered lamb?
So one of our pastoral recommendations for aiming at a politics of new creation that sees the flourishing of creation is to pastorally tell parables. Tell parables like Jesus did. As we mentioned, we know that folks are so quick to just want to line up and figure out which side of the power struggle you're on, right? And sometimes it feels like every Sunday when you get in a pulpit, there's a litmus test that you're being held to. And, well, you talked about this, but you didn't talk about this. And what phrases are you using or not using on social media? Jesus had this marvelous way of responding when people tried to put him in a box or figure out what his partisan affiliation was, because all that stuff was still very much a part of the world and culture. Power struggle was very much a thing.
We didn't invent partisanship.
Right.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Whenever people would try to pigeonhole Jesus, he would tell a story. And almost always it was a story that broke down the categories that they were trying to hold him to. It confounded the categories. And so he would tell stories that cast vision and shapes imagination rather than presenting propositions or propaganda. Jesus' stories weren't made to manipulate or shame people into particular behaviors, but to call them to something bigger and better. And so the parables that Jesus tells, I really believe they're not just like cool tricks that he had because he was a son of God, but opening up a way for us to speak and talk with one another as the people of God, that we tell stories. For instance, I have a weekly practice of sending the staff an email that begins with just a bullet-pointed list of a couple, not even full stories, but a couple of sentences about things that have happened in the life of the church this last week. And I call them highlights, but what I think about them more is these are the this is it stories. So like this story right here, this is it. This is why we do what we do. This is what the church is all about. And so every week forcing myself to sit down and think, what happened this last week that is it, that is the real story, flesh and blood stuff that reminds us that new creation is breaking into the old, that we can hold up for people to aim their lives at and to point towards. And so when I discipline myself to sit down and reflect back on the week of ministry, even if it doesn't go out to anybody, even if it's just for myself to point and say, this is it, those stories matter and they shape things, right? And so I see that coming out more and more in preaching and in all kinds of ways, that being able to tell stories right now, I just think is so important to grab hold of the tradition of parables that Christians have.
And if we have trouble seeing the this is it things, that's precisely what 2 Kings is trying to do. It's trying to call attention to this is it. There are the kings on the hilltops, and then there is God's work in the valley among the people who wouldn't have a shot at any of those kinds of like political power. So one of the other recommendations we have is to continue to be a prophet, calling people to the attention of what God is doing in the valley. It's really to examine over and over again, are we lining ourselves up with one of those kings on the hilltop? Because those kings are always going to be making promises to us, like, I can do this, I'll be able to fix this if you just line yourself up with me. But that was one of the temptations that Jesus had to face down from the very beginning of his ministry, that The tempter comes to Jesus and says, if you'll just worship me, I'll give you all of the kingdoms. And Jesus says, not a chance. I'm not doing that because I'm not here to get one of those kingdoms. I'm here to offer a completely different politics, offer the world a completely different people, redeem the world in this brand new way. And that's going to take a prophetic vision that stories like the ones we find in 2 Kings spark in our imagination. We need to hear those stories over and over again to say that's where it really is taking place. Our faith is putting our political money on the line, so to speak, to align ourselves with those stories and not try to claw our way out of the valley to just get with one of those kings. Because ultimately what Revelation is saying to us is those kingdoms will fall, and we don't want to be left out of that reality. So that's one of the pastoral recommendations we would make. Have that prophetic imagination. Let the stories of books like 2 Kings go to work on your prophetic imagination. Continue to call people to the valley, especially when they are tempted to bow down and worship someone else for the sake of getting a kingdom, or to align themselves with a king on a hilltop.
Yeah. And to really see the role then also of story listener and storyteller. I think as pastors, preachers, which, I hope we have a lot of lay folks that are interested in this stuff too, but it's easy to think of ourselves as, we're the storytellers. We're the one that get to shape the story. But first, we have to be story listeners, to listen well to the stories of our neighbors and the stories of our congregations so that we can tell good and faithful stories. So next, we want to offer new creation politics as a politics of abundance. Oftentimes in election years, we ramp up the rhetoric of fear and scarcity, right? Here's what you got to be afraid of. And if you don't want that to happen, then vote for this person. And here's what there's not going to be enough of. And so if you don't want to be caught without toilet paper in your cupboard, vote for this person, right? It's like that's often what politics resorts to in election year cycles is fear and scarcity. And as the people of God, we don't have to buy into that because we serve a God of abundance. And that's part of what we've uncovered too in the book of 2 Kings is the ridiculous abundance of a God who makes oil overflow and flour when there wasn't enough, and a God who takes care of widows who've lost their sons. I mean, it just over and over, the people who should have nothing have more than they needed because of God's abundance. And so if we really are people that trust in the abundance of God, we don't approach political decisions out of fear and scarcity. And anything else you want to offer about that before I want to talk about prayer as a political force? But I know you have good stuff to say on fear and scarcity.
No, let's keep going.
Prayer is good. This is where, how do we combat a politics of fear and really live into a politics of abundance? I think that prayer is a political force, and it is this subversive practice. When you think about it, prayer offers no worldly productivity. And you think Christians for generations have been practicing prayer and fasting coupled with one another. Fasting is saying to the world, we're not worried about scarcity, right? Like we can even go without food or without other certain worldly comforts as we are leaning into the presence of God.
We only ask for daily bread in our prayer.
Yeah. So the practices of prayer and fasting really can become for us, I think, a political force that aligns us with a politics of abundance, God's abundance, right? And so to call your congregations and to call brothers and sisters into postures of prayer and fasting, that is not centered around the power struggle, not praying and fasting about who's going to win the power struggle, but praying and fasting for God to reconcile all things, for God to bring about the flourishing of creation, for God to lift the people of the valley, and for God to bring the abundance of new creation here on earth.
So I hope that's been helpful. We want to offer these as a resource to you. Again, the book does a lot more of this in more detail, and you can pick that up if you want to do that. The small group curriculum is available totally free on the Foundry website. The sermon outlines are available for totally free on the Foundry website as well. But we just simply want to, I think, encapsulate all of this under the proclamation, the confession of the good news of Jesus Christ, that God is making all things new. And the Christian faith has staked its existence on the fact that the way God is making things new is through a peasant carpenter from the wrong side of the tracks who was born to a virgin with no political power and was born into the line of a people who had experienced exile time and time again. This is the good news, that God is making all things new, and that God is continuing to call a people into this strange pattern of redemption. And we have a choice, a juxtaposition that we live in every single day. Are we going to line up with these kings who are always going to do what kings are going to do? They're always going to go after sheep. They're always going to go to war with one another. They're always going to engage in the power struggle as if that's the highest form of life. And the confession that we have to offer, the good news that we have to offer, is that that's not the way God is redeeming the world. Can some good things come as a result of the political engagement in our life? Absolutely. But not for the sake of just winning. It's always for the sake of lining up with the way that God is making all things new in the way of Jesus. We hope that's been helpful. We hope that you will lean into Elisha's prophetic call to be a people of the valley and to turn away from those power positions, those power brokers that would call to us, that would tempt us out of the valley, and to live as God's faithful people, because this really is the way that God is making the world new.
So thanks for joining us here at our dining room table while our kids are asleep and the dryer is dinging to tell me that the towels are done and the neighbor's dogs are barking. But really, isn't this the kind of place where we work out what the vision of the kingdom of God looks like? I mean, it's not just the lofty rhetoric and theologizing. It is sitting around tables and doing life together and trusting that God is at work in and among it. So thanks for in and among us. So thanks for joining us at our dining room table. It's way too late for me to be putting these sentences together. We are praying for you and rooting for you as you follow Jesus in this election year.
We'd love to hear from you. Give us your suggestions in that comment section on how you can prophetically call your people this, and we truly hope to see you around sometime soon. Christ's peace be with you.